Mafia Boss finds a return to sender notebook on his doorstep. It was written by his victim's son. The city of Milan belonged to Tiago Vittori, but he viewed it only as a sprawling board of cold mathematics and calculated risks. At 38, Tiago moved through his glass-walled penthouse with the predatory grace of a man who had never known the hesitation of a guilty conscience. His life was a masterclass in flawless execution. Every morning began the same. A tailored charcoal suit that fit like armor, a silent espresso, and a series of encrypted briefings that decided the fate of shipping docks and high-stakes political favors. He was a man of quiet dominance, a stone king who governed through a terrifying, whispered authority rather than the loud brutality of his predecessors. To Tiago, emotions were nothing more than data points to be managed or deleted. He had spent 2 decades hardening his heart into a diamond. Unbreakable, brilliant, and freezing to the touch. He prided himself on his surgical precision, a trait that had allowed him to prune his organization of any perceived rot without a second thought. Loyalty was a transaction, betrayal was a debt paid in lead. On this particular Tuesday, the air was unusually crisp, the kind of cold that seemed to sharpen the edges of the skyscrapers. Tiago returned to his private residence after a midnight meeting, his broad shoulders tensed with the weight of a multi-million-euro merger. As he approached his front door, a reinforced slab of oak that served as the final gate to his sanctuary, his sharp dark eyes caught a flicker of something out of place. His security team was elite, his perimeter supposedly impenetrable. Yet there, sitting directly on his doorstep, was an object that defied every protocol of his life. It wasn't a briefcase, a threat, or a sophisticated explosive. It was a worn, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and its spine cracked from years of heavy use. Tiago paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. A strange, primal instinct, one he hadn't felt since he was a foot soldier in the slums, stirred in his chest. He signaled his guards to stand down with a sharp flick of his wrist. Stooping down, he picked up the book. The leather felt warm, as if it had just left someone's hands. Taped to the cover was a small, white scrap of paper. The handwriting was elegant yet strained, the ink pressing deep into the fiber of the page. It held only 3 words, return to sender. Tiago stepped into the foyer, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He didn't turn on the lights. In the dim glow of the city skyline, he flipped open the first page. He expected a ransom note or a list of demands. Instead, he found a photograph of a man he hadn't thought about in years, Dominic Carbone, smiling at a small, dark-eyed boy. Beneath the photo, the first entry began, "You don't remember the day you killed him, but I remember the way he smelled like tobacco and peppermint when he hugged me goodbye." The Stone King felt a hairline fracture spread across the surface of his heart. For the first time in his life, Tiago Vittori was afraid to turn the page. The silence of the penthouse was usually a sanctuary, but as Tiago sank into his Italian leather armchair, the room felt cavernous and cold. He turned the page of the notebook, and for the first time in years, the Stone King found his breath hitching. The handwriting was no longer the neat script of a cover note, it was the raw, jagged prose of a boy trying to keep a ghost alive. "Dear Mr. Vittori," the letter began. "My father didn't teach me how to shoot a gun, even though I know that's what you paid him for. He taught me how to tie a tie. He told me that a man's word is his only true currency, and if you spend it cheaply, you'll end up a beggar." Tiago closed his eyes, the memory of Dominic Carbone surfacing like a body from the depths of a dark lake. He remembered Dominic. Not as a father, but as a silent shadow in a dark suit, an enforcer who moved with a discipline that made other men look like amateurs. He had been the man Tiago trusted to handle the quiet problems. Until the whispers of a side deal with the Genovese family reached Tiago's ears. In Tiago's world, a whisper was as good as a confession. He had signed the order without looking Dominic in the eye. The letter continued, pulling Tiago back into the ink. "I remember the last Saturday. He spent 4 hours teaching me how to change a tire in the rain because he said a man should never be stranded by something he has the power to fix. He was covered in grease and laughing. He told me, "Luca, life is going to throw more than rain at you. You just have to keep your hands steady." As Tiago read, the clinical image of Dominic, the asset, began to dissolve, replaced by the vivid, painful reality of Dominic, the father. Luca's voice was hauntingly observant. He described a man who read poetry in the early hours of the morning and who saved every cent of his danger pay not for jewelry or cars, but for a college fund labeled the future. "You saw a traitor," the letter read, the ink smudging as if the writer's hand had been shaking. "But I saw a man who stayed up until 2 a.m. helping me with my geometry because he wanted me to build things instead of breaking them. He loved you, Tiago. He spoke of you like a brother who had lost his way. He said you were a man who had forgotten that the strongest heart isn't made of stone, it's made of the people you protect." Tiago looked at the photograph again. He saw the rugged face of his old friend, the man who had once taken a blade meant for Tiago's ribs in a back alley in Rome. Dominic hadn't begged for his life because he had already given it to his son. The realization hit Tiago with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just removed a liability. He had executed the only man who truly believed he was still capable of being human. The letter ended with a chilling observation: "He's gone now, and the men who told you he was a traitor are the ones driving his car today. Do you feel safe, Mr. Vittori? Because the only man who would have died for you is the one you put in the ground." Tiago stared at the city lights, the notebook heavy in his lap. The mathematics of his life no longer added up. The memory came back not in flashes, but in a heavy, suffocating gray. 6 years ago, the Vittori Empire had been under siege from the Genovese family, and paranoia was the only oxygen Tiago breathed. In that world, loyalty wasn't a given, it was a variable that changed with the wind. When a ledger surfaced showing Dominic Carbone's signature next to a series of unauthorized meetings in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Milan, Tiago didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't believe in explanations. He believed in the math of survival. L plus B equals D, loyalty plus betrayal equals death. It was a cold, binary logic that had kept him alive while other men bled out in gutters. To Tiago, Dominic was no longer the man who had shared a bottle of wine with him at his wedding, he was a security breach. A cracked pillar. And if a pillar is cracked, you pull it down before the whole roof collapses on your head. The night of the cold order was rain-slicked and silent. Tiago had summoned Dominic to a private hangar at the edge of the city. He remembered the way the hangar's fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, skeletal shadows across the concrete. He had stayed in the back of his sedan, the tinted glass a physical barrier between his humanity and his duty. He watched through the window as his top lieutenants, Enzo and Silvio, approached Dominic. Dominic didn't look like a traitor. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his rugged face calm, his eyes searching the dark car as if looking for Tiago's gaze. He knew why he was there. In their world, you don't get invited to a deserted hangar at 3 a.m. for a promotion. Silvio had pulled the weapon, the metallic click echoing in the vast space. Tiago expected a plea. He expected Dominic to scream about his years of service or the bullet he had once taken for Tiago in Rome. He expected him to mention Luca. But Dominic did something far more unsettling. He simply nodded. He stood straight, adjusted the lapel of his jacket, and looked directly into the camera lens mounted on the hangar wall, knowing Tiago was watching the feed. There was no fear in his eyes, only a profound, weary disappointment. It was the look of a father realizing his son had failed a test he didn't even know he was taking. He didn't beg for mercy because he knew Tiago had already murdered his own so long before he gave the order for Dominic's heart to stop beating. "Do it," Tiago had whispered into his intercom, his voice a flat, dead thing. The muzzle flash had illuminated the hangar for a fraction of a second, and then Dominic Carbone was gone. Tiago had watched the body fall with the same clinical detachment he used to check a stock portfolio. He had told himself it was the price of an empire. He had told himself that sentiment was a luxury the Stone King could not afford. But now, sitting in the dark with Luca's notebook, Tiago realized the logic had been flawed from the start. He hadn't protected the empire, he had executed its foundation. Silvio and Enzo, the men who had discovered the ledger, were the ones who had gained the most from Dominic's absence. As the realization settled in his gut like cold lead, Tiago understood that he hadn't been a genius of strategy. He had been a puppet for the very men he thought he was leading. The penthouse was a tomb of glass and shadow as Tiago turned the next page. His eyes, trained for decades to spot the slightest deviation in a ledger or a lie in a soldier's gaze, began to scan Luca's words with a new, frantic intensity. He wasn't just reading a memoir anymore, he was reviewing a cold case. The entry was dated 3 weeks before Dominic's execution. "Dad came home late tonight," Luca had written. "He didn't think I saw him, but he was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bank statements that weren't his. He looked sick. He told me, 'Luca, sometimes the people you take a bullet for are the ones holding the gun.' I asked him if he was in trouble. He just hugged me and said he was making sure the Vittori name stayed clean, even if he had to get his own hands dirty to do it." Tiago paused, his heart thudding against his ribs. The narrative he had lived by for 6 years was that Dominic had been meeting the Genovese family to sell routes. But the notebook told a different story. Luca described his father's secret meetings not as betrayals, but as a private investigation. Dominic hadn't been selling the Vittori secrets, he had been tracking the money Silvio and Enzo were siphoning off into offshore accounts. As Tiago flipped through the pages, he found a folded, yellowing receipt tucked into the binding. It was for a cafe, the same cafe where the traitorous meetings allegedly took place. On the back, in Dominic's hurried, familiar scrawl, were names and figures. Silvio, 12% kickback. Enzo, Genovese contact. The realization hit Tiago like a physical blow. Dominic wasn't meeting the Genovese family to betray Tiago, he was meeting their middleman to buy the evidence of Silvio's treachery. He had been trying to protect the Stone King from the vipers inside his own throne room. He was scared, the next page read. He told me if anything happened to him, I should never go to the police. He said, Tiago is a good man blinded by a bad world. One day, he'll need to see the truth, and you're the only one who can show him. Tiago let the notebook fall against his chest. The cold order hadn't been an act of strength, it had been the ultimate failure of judgment. He had been a puppet, manipulated by the very men who now stood at his right and left hand. Silvio and Enzo hadn't discovered a traitor, they had executed a whistleblower using Tiago's own hand to pull the trigger. The ink on the page seemed to shimmer like a phantom. The ghost in the ink wasn't just Dominic's memory, it was his final, silent act of loyalty. Even in death, Dominic Carbone was still trying to save Tiago Vittori from the men who were currently bleeding the empire dry. Tiago stood up, the notebook clutched in his hand. The math had finally changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about a debt that could only be paid in truth and retribution. Tiago did not summon his lieutenants to the boardroom. Instead, he retreated into the digital shadows of his empire, a ghost haunting his own machines. For years, he had trusted the reports handed to him by Silvio and Enzo, but now, with Luca's notebook open beside his keyboard, he saw the ledger through a different lens. He wasn't looking for the math they showed him. He was looking for the silence in between the numbers. He began a shadow audit, bypassing the primary servers and tapping into the raw logistics of their shipping routes in the port of Genoa. He stayed awake until the sun began to bleed over the Milanese skyline, his eyes tracing the flow of ghost containers, shipments that existed on the manifests but never arrived at the warehouses. The pattern was unmistakable. For every 10 shipments of legitimate cargo, one vanished into a shell company controlled by a Genovese front. The kickbacks Dominic had noted in his frantic scrawl weren't just small thefts, they were a systematic hemorrhaging of the Vittori wealth. Silvio had been the architect of the logistics, and Enzo had been the muscle ensuring no one asked questions. As the data compiled into a damning web of betrayal, Tiago realized the true depth of the conspiracy. The evidence they had presented against Dominic 6 years ago, the grainy photos of him at the cafe, had been a brilliant piece of theater. Dominic hadn't been selling routes, he had been intercepting the Genovese couriers to find the ledger that proved Silvio's involvement. He had been a hero acting alone, knowing that if he brought the news to Tiago without proof, the Vipers would kill him before he could speak. Tiago watched the screen as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A wire transfer from 3 days after Dominic's execution showed a massive deposit into an offshore account in Silvio's name. It was the blood bonus for a job well done. They hadn't just used Dominic as a scapegoat, they had used Tiago's own paranoia as the weapon to remove the only man who could have stopped them. The Stone King felt a cold, vibrating rage settle into his bones. He had spent 6 years honoring the men who had betrayed him and vilifying the man who had died for him. Every handshake with Silvio, every toast with Enzo, felt like a slow-acting poison in his veins. He didn't move. He didn't call for his security. He sat in the quiet of his office, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, deadly beat on the desk. He was no longer just an administrator of crime, he was a predator who had found the scent of the wolves within his own pack. The shadow boxing was over. Now, it was time for the hunt. Tiago traded his armored sedan for a nondescript gray SUV, slipping out of his fortress without a single bodyguard. He needed to see the living consequence of his coldness with his own eyes. He drove to the outskirts of the city, to a neighborhood where the buildings leaned against one another like tired old men, the place where Dominic's family had been forced to retreat after the traitors' assets were seized by the Vittori estate. He found the boy outside a small community library. Luca Bellini was no longer the toddler in the photograph, he was 17, slender and tall, with a stillness that felt dangerous. He stood on the sidewalk, a messenger bag slung over his shoulder, watching the world with an intensity that made Tiago's grip tighten on the steering wheel. Luca didn't have the rugged, brawling build of his father. He was thoughtful, his face sharper, more refined. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were Dominic's eyes, deep, dark, and observant. But where Dominic's gaze had held a weary warmth, Luca's held a cold, flickering fire. It was the look of a boy who had spent a decade feeding on unanswered questions and the bitter bread of injustice. Tiago watched as a black car with tinted windows, a car he recognized as part of Silvio's security fleet, slowly cruised past the boy. Luca didn't flinch. He didn't run. He simply stood his ground, staring back at the dark glass with a defiant, buried anger that seemed to vibrate in the air. He knew he was being watched. He knew the Vipers were circling. Seeing him in the flesh changed the notebook from a story into a debt. Tiago saw the way Luca carried himself, with the silent dignity Dominic had displayed in that hangar. The boy was a living testament to everything Tiago had tried to crush. He wasn't just a victim's son, he was the final, uncorrupted piece of Dominic Carbone, standing alone against the empire that had broken his world. A sudden, sharp realization pierced Tiago's chest. Luca hadn't left the notebook on the doorstep out of hope. He had left it as a final testament. He knew Silvio and Enzo were closing in to clean up the last witness to their ancient lie. The notebook was a message in a bottle thrown into a storm, and Tiago was the only one who could stop the waves from crashing down. For the first time in his life, the Stone King felt a visceral, protective rage that had nothing to do with territory or profit. He wasn't looking at a liability. He was looking at his own chance for salvation. As Luca turned to walk away, his head held high despite the shadows trailing him, Tiago put the car in gear. The watcher was done observing. It was time for the protector to wake up. Back in the solitude of his office, the neon pulse of Milan blurred into a streak of cold light against the window. Tiago sat with the notebook open to the very last page. The paper here was different, crisp, new, and devoid of the nostalgia that filled the earlier chapters. This wasn't a memory. This was a suicide note written in the present tense. Tonight, the air feels the same as the night you took him, the entry began, the ink heavy and dark. Silvio's men have been parked at the corner since sunset. They aren't hiding anymore. I think they realize that I know too much, or maybe they just got tired of waiting for me to disappear on my own. Tiago's breath stilled. His eyes raced across the lines, feeling the weight of a 17-year-old's resignation. I'm not going to run, Tiago. My father taught me that a man stands his ground, even when the ground is shaking. I left this notebook for you because I wanted you to know that you didn't just kill a soldier, you killed the only man who still believed you had a soul. If you're reading this, I'm probably already with him. I hope the Empire was worth the silence. The final sentence was written in a hand so steady it was terrifying. I forgive you, not for what you did to him, but for the man you've had to become to live with it. They're coming up the stairs now. Goodbye. The silence that followed was deafening. Tiago checked the timestamp Luca had scrawled at the bottom. It was barely 20 minutes old. The Cold Order wasn't just ancient history, it was repeating itself in real time. Silvio wasn't just siphoning funds, he was cleaning house, erasing the last living evidence of his decade-old frame-up. A surge of adrenaline, hotter and more violent than anything Tiago had felt in years, shattered the Stone King's composure. He didn't call for a driver. He didn't wait for a tactical team. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the one thing he rarely touched anymore, his own sidearm. He realized now that Luca hadn't accepted his fate out of weakness. He had accepted it to prove a point. He was willing to die just to show Tiago the mirror. But Tiago was done looking at his own reflection. He tore out of the penthouse, the notebook still clutched in his hand like a holy relic. The math of his life had finally been solved. Betrayal / silence equals death, but truth plus action equals redemption. If he lost Luca, the Vittori name would truly mean nothing but ashes. He had 6 minutes to cross a city that usually took 20. He drove as if he were trying to outrun the last 6 years of his life. The narrow hallway of the tenement building smelled of damp concrete and old cooking, a far cry from the sterile luxury of Tiago's tower. He moved through the shadows with a terrifying fluidity, his tailored suit a dark blur against the peeling wallpaper. At the end of the corridor, 3 men stood outside Luca's door. Tiago recognized them instantly, Silvio's personal cleaners. They were professionals, the kind who didn't make noise, but they hadn't expected the king to descend from his mountain. The lead hitman had his hand on the door handle when Tiago stepped into the light. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a dozen years of lies. The men froze, their eyes widening as they looked into the face of Tiago Vittori. He didn't look like their boss, he looked like an avenging ghost. The boy stays, Tiago said, his voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated in the small space. One of the men reached for his waistband, a fatal mistake. Tiago's movements were a masterclass in the surgical precision he had long claimed as his hallmark. Before the man could even clear leather, Tiago fired. 2 shots, muffled by the close quarters, echoed like heartbeats. The first hitman slumped against the doorframe, dead before he hit the floor. The other 2 scrambled, but they were trapped in a narrow kill zone of their own making. Tiago didn't waste motion. He stepped into the fray, his dark eyes missing nothing. He disarmed the second man with a brutal, calculated strike to the wrist and followed with a shot that ended the threat. The third man threw up his hands, his face pale with the realization that the Stone King had finally found his conscience. "Who sent you?" Tiago asked, his gun leveled at the man's forehead. "You know who," the man stammered, his voice cracking. "Silvio, he said the boy was the last thread. He said you'd want it done." "Silvio lied," Tiago whispered. With a final, decisive action, Tiago cleared the hallway. The violence had been swift, cold, and absolute, a debt repaid in lead. He stood over the bodies, the copper scent of blood filling the air, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt the suffocating fog of paranoia lift. He wasn't killing for profit or power tonight, he was killing to protect a legacy he had almost destroyed. The door to the apartment creaked open. Luca stood there, his face pale but his gaze as steady as the one Tiago had seen in the hangar. He looked at the bodies, then up at Tiago, and finally at the notebook clutched in the mobster's left hand. "You came," Luca whispered. "I'm late," Tiago replied, his voice breaking for the first time. "But the Vipers are finished. I'm taking you home." Behind them, the city hummed, unaware that the hierarchy of its underworld had just been decapitated. Tiago reached out a hand, not the hand of a boss, but the hand of a man who had finally decided to be a hero. 6 months later, the glass walls of the Vittori Tower no longer felt like a fortress, but a lens. Tiago stood at his window, watching the Milanese traffic flow like veins of light through the city. The Stone King was still a man of silence, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the hollow quiet of a tomb, it was the watchful peace of a guardian. Silvio and Enzo were gone, their names erased from the ledgers as thoroughly as their influence had been purged from the streets. Tiago had spent the last half-year dismantling the corruption Dominic had died trying to expose, turning his surgical precision toward healing the wounds he had inflicted on his own empire. Across the city, in a quiet courtyard of the University of Milan, Luca Bellini sat on a stone bench. Beside him lay a familiar leather-bound notebook. It had been delivered to him a week after the night in the hallway, tucked inside a package that included a full academic scholarship and a deed to a property in his mother's name. Luca opened the notebook to the very last page, the one after his own final entry. There, in a handwriting that was sharp, controlled, and unmistakably Tiago's, was the only response he would ever receive. "A man's word is his only true currency," the note began, echoing Dominic's own words. "I spent mine cheaply once, and it cost me the only brother I ever had. I cannot give you back your hero, but I can promise that the world he wanted for you is the one I will spend the rest of my life building. You told me the strongest heart is made of the people we protect. Thank you for reminding me how to breathe." The note was unsigned. It didn't need a name, the weight of the truth behind it was signature enough. Luca looked up and caught the eye of a man in a dark suit standing near the library entrance, a permanent shadow who moved with the same disciplined grace Dominic once had. He wasn't there to intimidate, he was there to ensure that the future Dominic had saved for in that small fund would actually come to pass. Back in the penthouse, Tiago picked up a small photo that now sat permanently on his desk. It was the picture of Dominic and a young Luca. He realized then that he hadn't just found a notebook on his doorstep that night, he had found a map leading him out of the dark. He had built an empire on fear, thinking it was the only way to be untouchable, but a 17-year-old boy with a pen had shown him that true power lay in the courage to be human. The Stone King was gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood that some debts can never be fully repaid, they can only be honored, one honest page at a time.